It was supposed to be a regular, everyday flight. The weather was great. Everything looked great. The plane sounded great. They took off on time. Everything was running normal. But shortly after the commercial flight left, that normal went right out the window. As the plane hit 23,000 feet in elevation, the cockpit window literally blew off of the plane. It was June of 1996 on a plane from Birmingham, England to Malaga, Spain. Captain Lancaster was 41 years old. He had 21 years of piloting experience. He'd been sitting in the pilot's chair, fully seat belted in, strapped in, secure, when the window blew out. The sudden decompression of the cockpit sucked the captain right out of his seat, right out of his seatbelt even. Passengers reported hearing an explosion from the cockpit. The plane immediately began to dive. Passengers began screaming, praying, hugging their children. The co-pilot was finally able to grab control of the plane. He flew it for 15 minutes to safely land in Southampton, England. The British Air Pilots Association supervisor said later that it seemed to be simply a freak accident, that nothing could have been done beforehand to have better prevented this from happening. But those 15 minutes, I bet, felt like an eternity for Captain Lancaster, whose ankles were actually grabbed by a quick-acting crew member. The force of the plane's speed made it impossible to grab or to bring Captain Lancaster back into the cockpit. So for those 15 minutes, crew members traded shifts as they squeezed onto his ankles, holding him from taking off. Captain Lancaster, whose shirt had been ripped off in the force, was treated for shock, a fractured elbow, a broken wrist, and a broken thumb, and even got frostbite on one of his hands. But he was alive. The crew that day was praised widely for their alertness and response. They were alert and they responded. It wasn't just that they responded. If they had responded without being alert, their response would have been too late. They weren't just alert without a response. If they had been alert without a response, they would have just sat there and looked out the window as he went flying off. As we've been learning in this series, those involved in the story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection all had different kinds of responses. When we look at just those who loved Jesus, who followed Jesus, we see some not great responses. We see despair. We see confusion. We see fear. And only the response of reacting to his death. In other words, the only real response we see is the women heading back to the tomb on Sunday morning to care for his body. That's the only real response we see happening. If we're honest, their responses were short of anything special, short of anything faithful. We don't find the disciples studying their Bibles. We don't see people going to the tomb ready to see a risen Savior. The men on the road to Emmaus, as we discussed last time, are heartbroken. They are blinded by their despair. We do see the women who followed Jesus at least going about the beautiful Christian work of caring for his body, right? This is an important Christian principle of caring for those in need. Their responses were due to their lack of alertness. And this is what we've been learning in the first 3 parts. No one was turning to the Scriptures. Jesus had to come back and walk with the men on the road to Emmaus and get them to open the Word of God, right? If he had just simply shown himself to them, they would have believed and jumped for joy, but they wouldn't have learned the life lesson they needed, one that would make them ready for eternity. They had to read the Scriptures. We've learned that when you and I are struggling, the devil loves to tempt us to turn off, right? To disconnect, to just be by ourselves, to zone out of life, to zone into other things. Humanity looks for either quick fixes like food, anger, gossip, alcohol, tobacco products, or even the judgment of others, right? Something I've learned as I've grown older, as I've matured finally, I've learned that many times people who pick and complain about others are simply just trying to ignore themselves, their own faults. But humanity also looks for other ways outside of that, ways to not do anything, ways to just shut off, to disengage, to turn off their alertness, to not respond, and to just float through life. So much so that we've literally created a new term, Netflix and chill, right? I'm going to go home from work and I'm just going to Netflix and chill. I'm just going to relax, stop working, stop stressing, and just focus on the TV. In difficult times, many times we seem to morph, to change ourselves from children of God to sloths, slow moving, slow reacting. None of this shows alertness. None of this is a biblical principle. If the crew had reacted the natural way, the normal way of just watching things go by, they literally would have watched him go by. Captain Lancaster would not be alive to this day. He would have been found in a field laying next to the window. We need to be alert, pay attention, be vigilant, right? Be clear-minded and sober. We need to react. In many ways, when this COVID-19 thing first hit, many of us reacted. And we kind of discussed this last time. We kind of reacted. We went forward. We did new things. And now we're just like exhausted. Now we're just like, when is this thing over, right? We can't get like that. We've got to stay focused, keep reacting, staying alert. When our marriages are slumping, sadly, many times we don't even realize it. That's because we're not alert. But when our marriages are slumping, react. When your walk with God is down, react. And again, same thing. Many times we don't even realize it because we're not alert enough. We're not paying attention enough. When you are hurt or feeling alone, react. Do something about it. I know that as I say that, though, many of us, maybe all of us, are asking the very important question. Okay, react. How? How? What do we do? What do we do in these situations? The answer to how we react will depend on our level of alertness. It goes back to being alert. So, to better understand this, let's discuss that eventful Sunday morning as groups of women came to and from the empty tomb. So I wanted to take some time and just read through a few verses from all 4 of the Gospels. And let me give you a little warning. As we look at these stories about these women, you're likely going to get confused. If you're paying attention, you're reading along, you're very likely to get confused as well. That's okay. We're going to put it all together, I promise. So let's grab the first gospel, Matthew. Matthew chapter 28. Matthew chapter 28, and let's catch this. Let's see what it says here. We're going to read verses 1, and then 9, and then 10. Matthew chapter 28, verse 1. Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. All right, verse 9 and 10. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, Rejoice! So they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. Okay, so we've got Mary Magdalene and another Mary. And once they realize what's taken place, they run to tell the disciples, right? Jesus stops the women, discusses things with them, talks to them, they fall down and they worship. Okay, the book of Mark. Let's catch this. Mark chapter 16 and we're going to start at verse 1. Mark 16 verse 1 says this. Now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices that they might come and anoint him. Let's go to verse 8 through 11. So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him, as they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive, he had been and had been seen by her, they did not believe. Okay? Catch the book of Luke. Turn over to the next book here. Luke chapter 24. You're already starting to see a few differences there? Luke chapter 24, and then verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they and certain other women with them came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared. Now verse 9. Then they returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and to the rest. John chapter 20 and verse 1 and 2 says this. Now the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went up to the tomb early while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, John, the author of this gospel, and said to them, They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Okay, now let's jump down to verse 11. Now the 3 of them have come back to the tomb. 11 through 18. But Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb. And she saw 2 angels in white, sitting one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? She said to them, Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. Now when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, and did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, Sir, if you have carried him away, tell him where you have laid him, and I will take him away. Jesus said to her, Mary. And she turned and said to him, Rabboni, which is to say, teacher. That's good. We'll stop there in verse 16. So let me sum these 4 up. Matthew said Mary and the other Mary, they come to the tomb. They end up running off to tell the disciples. Jesus stops the women and they rejoice. Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary, the other Mary, and Salome are there. They were told to tell, but they didn't because they were afraid. Then Jesus first appears to Mary Magdalene. Luke says women who were involved with the burial came along with other women. They were reminded of the resurrection. They remembered the words of Jesus. And then Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, and the other women tell the disciples. John says Mary was by herself. She sees it empty. She runs to tell the disciples, including John. Jesus appears to Mary first, and she runs to tell the disciples again. You may be feeling a little, wait, hold on. Those sound like different stories to me. And that's a natural response because they sound like different stories. They sound like they're not linking, they're not syncing together, right? In fact, they seem like 4 different Bible stories, and websites, atheists who believe that the Bible is full of errors or inconsistencies, constantly point at these 4 stories and go, see, look, they don't make any sense. They just have nothing to do with each other. They blame the 4 Gospels of kind of the authors of dropping the ball and not linking together. So why? Why do we have seemingly 4 different stories? Here's another wonderful example of why we're so blessed to have the spirit of prophecy through Ellen White. The spirit of prophecy given to us through the writings of Ellen White, specifically in this case, the book Desire of Ages. When you read this story in the book Desire of Ages, it makes perfect sense. It makes so much more sense. And so I strongly, strongly encourage you, take some time today to read this chapter from Desire of Ages. It's called Why Are You Weeping? Or if you have one of the original Desire of Ages, Why Weepest Thou? Right? If it's written in the King James. First, I want you to read the story because it flows. The story flows so well together, and it really is great. Secondly, it's so encouraging. This chapter is so incredibly encouraging, especially if you feel a slump, especially if you feel down, especially if you feel stressed, especially if you feel paranoid, especially if you feel sad. It doesn't matter the negative emotion or the emotion. This is powerful. For example, here's how the chapter ends. This is page 794. She says this, "Mourn not as those who are hopeless and helpless. Jesus lives, and because he lives, we live also. From grateful hearts, from lips touched with holy fire, let your glad song ring out. Christ is risen. He lives to make intercession for you and I." And then I underlined this sentence. I love this. "Grasp this hope, and it will hold the soul like a sure tried anchor. Believe, and thou shalt see the glory of God." That's the last few sentences of this chapter. It's powerful. It's beautiful. I want to read what I underlined again. Grasp this hope. Reach out, take it, and hold it. The hope. And it will hold the soul, or in other words, it will hold you like a sure tried anchor. Reach out and hold it, and it will hold you like an anchor. I love it. It's powerful. It's good stuff. Please take time to read this chapter today. That's your Sabbath assignment. Find the time as a family, alone, call somebody, read it to them, read it with them. Beautiful, beautiful chapter. It's not very long either. Why are you weeping? Beautiful. But back to what sounds like 4 different stories. The mistake isn't necessarily with the scriptures. I will admit they're written a bit confusing. They're written confusing. It does sound confusing. But it tends to be more with how we are reading it than how they are written. They are written a bit confusing. But that's not the source of the confusion, I don't believe. The source is how we are reading it. We tend to read it as if this was all taking place at once. That a group of women all came at once, and then the story goes all over the place from there. And it makes no sense. But rather, when you read the Desire of Ages, it flows perfectly together. The stories out of those 4 Gospels, they work. It's because of this very simple perspective that we're not given in the scriptures. It's actually different groups of women at different times from different directions. Different groups of women at different times from different directions. Literally, physically, geographically, different directions. They're coming in from different paths to this tomb. I want you to notice how the chapter actually begins. This is page 788. The women who had stood by the cross of Christ waited and watched for the hours of the Sabbath to pass. You know, it just struck me. So I'm going to go side note here. This is a really sad Sabbath for them. If they had listened to, what we're trying to learn from the first three, if they had listened to the word of Christ, if they had focused on what he had said, the promises and the prophecies he had about rising again, that would have been an amazing Sabbath. They would have been looking longingly and expectantly for their coming Lord, right? It wasn't supposed to be a bitter Sabbath. Life right now is not supposed to be bitter. We're supposed to be focused, longingly, expectantly for the coming Savior, right? What a cool thing to think. I hadn't caught that earlier as I wrote this. The women who stood by the cross of Christ waited and watched for the hours of the Sabbath to pass. Their hearts were broken. On the first day of the week, very early, they made their way to the tomb, taking with them precious spices to anoint the Savior's body. So she even kind of, as it starts, sounds as if they're all coming together. But keep reading. Just a few sentences later, she says this, same page, 788. The women had not all come to the tomb from the same direction. Different groups of women at different times coming from different directions. I admit the scriptures write it as if it's all at once, but that's our perspective as we read it. They're kind of putting the story together as if, but it's only in the way that we read it. It's not written that way. So, because once I read the chapter, you can go back and read the Gospels, it makes a little bit more sense. So let me kind of give you the bullet points. I want you to read the whole chapter. I'm not going to give you the whole chapter for free here. I really encourage you to read the chapter, but here's just some bullet points of the story. Number one, she says that Mary Magdalene arrives first alone. She arrives first. She sees an empty tomb and runs off to tell Peter and John the quote-unquote terrible news. Because at that point, she still has no idea what's taken place. She's scared that the body is gone, that someone has robbed the tomb. This is from the book of John. This is the perspective of John's gospel. Mary Magdalene came alone. This is the first telling to someone else. She first tells someone else that Jesus is gone. Number two, a second group of women then show up. They are told he is risen and to tell the disciples. They don't because they're confused, because they don't remember his words. They're full of fear. They don't remember his words. They hadn't been paying close enough attention. This is the perspective of the Gospel of Mark. So rather than reading the four Gospels all like as one story all at the same time, each Gospel is actually giving us a little different time perspective. John is first. Mary Magdalene came first. She sees an empty tomb. She runs off. And then his story is kind of paused. Mark steps in and says, and then these other women showed up. They were told he's risen to go tell the disciples, but they don't. And then Mark is kind of paused. Mary Magdalene, Peter, and John come running back to the tomb. Mary doesn't go in with them, but she remains outside. They inspect it, they leave. Then she peeks in, okay? They've returned upset and afraid, but now she peeks in and she sees the angel. Peter and John don't see the angel. Then she hears behind her a voice. It's Jesus. Jesus appears to her first, and she thinks he's a gardener. She leaps for joy when she realizes who it is, and she runs to tell the disciples what the first group of women had also been told, right? This is, again, the Gospel of John. So John kind of starts the story, and then he pauses. He doesn't tell us he pauses, but he pauses. Then Mark picks up the story, and then he tells us a part of the story, and then he pauses. And then we go back to the book of John, and John starts up again. So rather than them being 4 different stories, they're actually one story kind of pieced together. This is the second telling. This is when she goes back a second time to tell, but this time she's got the good news. He's risen, right? A third group of women then show up from a different direction. Angels tell them he is risen. They remember his words. They jump for joy, and they run off to go tell the disciples. On their way, Jesus stops them, meets with them, talks with them. They fall down, they cling to his feet, they worship him, and they get even more excited, and they go and tell the disciples. That's the perspective of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. That's the third telling to the disciples. So the disciples are not told once, they're told 3 different times. The women come at different times, right? Even with that, when you go back and read, there's still some confusion because just the way they're telling the story, the confusion is on us, the reader. It makes so much more sense when you read it this way. You don't read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all as if they're one story at the exact same moment. It's a little bit of John, then a little bit of Mark, then a little bit of, then back to John, and then Matthew and Luke kind of pick out pieces of those, and then they tell the end of the story. But the story, the theme of the story reigns true. Their confusion is turned to sanity. Their sorrow is turned to joy, all because of the resurrection of Jesus. Now at this point, you might be thinking, hold on, Pastor Phil, weren't you talking to us about being alert? Weren't you talking to us about our responses? Why are we going into a Bible study of how the Bible really works or how these stories work together? Yes, we were talking about being alert. We are talking about being alert. Yes, we are talking about our responses, and we literally just did it. We just exemplified how we're supposed to be alert and how we're supposed to respond. You see, you can read through the 4 Gospels, you read what sounds like 4 different stories, and you go, huh? This makes no sense. Natural human tendency is to, I'm just not getting it today. And then we close the Bible. Or we just keep reading, I don't get it, I don't know. And then we just keep going. Let's go see what the book of Acts says. Or many people go, see, look, Bible full of inconsistencies, forget it, and they drop it. Typically, our response is to give up, whether that's giving up and just reading on and forgetting about it, or giving up completely on God. Typically, our response is to give up. Just like in life, we may start to have a struggle. We may start to have an issue, and then typically we just give up. Or we handle it the wrong way. We handle it the wrong way, and it gets us nowhere. We kind of fade out with our vices or entertainment, right? But we need to stay alert. We need to respond. We need to react. And we did that. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't totally make sense because our perspective is that they're telling 4 stories or one story at the same time, but they're not. They're telling one story at different points of the story. So we stayed alert. We responded. We reacted. We said, okay, Lord, teach us more information. We turned to God and said, okay, God, what else you got for us? We opened the book of the Desire of Ages. We were fed more information. Rather than putting this book down, we opened up another book. And you know what's interesting? More often, it's the opposite way. So in case you think I'm saying, oh, you need to have the books of Ellen White to understand the Bible. In this case, it helps. In this one story. More often, I might say 99% of the time, it's the opposite way. You might be reading something from Ellen White and you go, huh? What? No, that doesn't make any sense. And then sometimes we cast it off. We put the books away. No, you know what? Forget it. Forget Ellen White. I'm just gonna read the Bible and only the Bible. Or we become a skeptic. Oh no, Ellen White. No, absolutely not. No, she's a false prophet. But we're supposed to be alert and respond and react. You read something in Ellen White and you go, huh? No, come on. What? And then you turn to the Bible and you study and go, oh wow, that's right, it is in there. I missed it. It is in there. So more often than not, it's the opposite way. You read Ellen White and you go, what? No way. And then you turn to the Bible and you go, oh, now that makes sense. In this case, this one case, really, I can't think of another case, but in this case, you read the scriptures and you go, huh? This doesn't make any sense. You turn to the Desire of Ages and go, oh, now it makes sense. Don't be a skeptic. Don't let the slump, the struggle, the bump in the road defeat you. Don't give up. Don't close the book. Open up books and keep reading, keep studying. We were alert, going, all right, something's not right. I got to figure this out. And then we responded and we reacted and we did it. Staying alert means not to stop responding. Keep digging, keep going, right? The flight crew weren't praised for being alert because they watched the captain get sucked out of the plane. They were praised for being alert because they reacted immediately. Bump in the road, big problem, big trouble. They reacted right away and did something about it. We've got to do the same thing, whether it's in our studies or in our trials, our tribulations, our persecutions, our loneliness, our depression, our stress. Whatever it is, stay on top of it. Stay alert and keep going. Keep going, keep going. React. Don't just sit back and chill. React and stay on top. Keep studying. In your slumps, in your trials, in your depression, do not give up. Keep going. Keep digging. We also learn this very truth in the story itself. We read it. You may have missed it, but we read this right here in this story. Let's go back to John a second time and read some verses a second time. We'll shorten it down a little bit. John 20, and we're just going to read verses 14 through 16. John 20, 14 through 16 says this. Now, when she had said this, that was she responded to the angel, remember? When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there and did not know it was him. Was she alert? No, not alert, right? We'll find out in a moment why she didn't recognize him. Jesus said, verse 15, Jesus said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? He didn't, put helium in his lungs and sound all, why are you weeping, right? He didn't change his voice. He didn't go deeper and try to hide himself. Hello, who are you seeking for? He spoke to her. She still doesn't get it. Notice, keep reading. She's supposing him to be the gardener. It's his voice. He's standing there. She's not alert. She's not paying attention. She says to him, Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. Verse 16, I love this. Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him, Rabboni, which means teacher. I love that. It's almost a facepalm moment. Jesus could have gone, oh, Mary. All right, you know what? good luck. You're on your own. I have fed you. I am standing right here in front of you. I'm speaking to you. I have fed you enough information. You should have got this by now. I'm done. I'm out of here. Jesus, though, stays alert and keeps responding. He keeps reacting. He keeps saying things, right? He gives her 2 questions at the beginning, not just one. He gives her 2 questions. Why are you weeping and who are you seeking for, right? And then when she still doesn't get it, he finally just goes, Mary, like, hello? Are you here? Are you listening? Are you paying attention? Hello? Ah, Jesus, right? She didn't recognize Jesus. Why not? The 4 stories don't tell us. Here's what Desire of Ages, page 790 says. Through her tear-dimmed eyes, Mary saw the form of a man, and thinking it was the gardener, ... Through her tear-dimmed eyes. Somebody spoke to her. Jesus spoke to her in his voice. Her mind was so blinded by her despair, her confusion, her angst, her stress, that her ears didn't hear his voice. Her eyes were so filled with tears, she didn't even bother to react by wiping them. She didn't even, shake her face and look at the guy. She responded in her despair, in her grief, in her sorrow. That's not being alert. That's not the right kind of response for our slumps. Don't respond in your grief. Don't respond in your loneliness. Don't respond in your depression. Rub your eyes and stay focused on Jesus. Her despair stopped her from getting more information. It stopped her from being alert. He was standing right in front of her. He had to say her name directly. Mary. I know how many times the Lord has had to say that to me. Phil, come on. Are you here with me or not? Right? Fill in the blank with your name. Right? Come on. Where are you? Are you here? Are you paying attention? Her despair controlled her reaction and response. She chose her despair instead of being alert. Alert would have been, rub her eyes and said, who's speaking to me? But she kept the tears in her eyes. She kept the grief in her mind, and she didn't pay attention. In fact, in Desire of Ages, we're told where her mind is instead. I fight with this. Having a conversation with someone and my mind is somewhere else. Maybe you have that issue too. Her mind was somewhere else. He's speaking. Who are you searching for, right? Who are you seeking? And she's still answering. Her mouth is moving, but her mind is somewhere else. Catch this, still on 790. If, this is what's going on in her mind. This is what she's thinking. If this rich man's tomb, this is Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, right? If this rich man's tomb was thought too honorable a burial place for Jesus, she herself would provide a place for him. There was a grave that Christ's own voice had made vacant, the grave where Lazarus had been lain. Might she not there find a burial place for her Lord? She felt that to care for his precious crucified body would be ready for this? Would be a great consolation to her in her grief. She wasn't looking to solve the big picture issue. She was trying to just deal with this grief. But you can't deal with grief in the grief. You can't deal with loneliness in your loneliness. You can't deal with your depression if you're thinking about your depression. If you stay there, we can't fix it. She was trying to console herself in her grief. Jesus was standing right in front of her. Family, Jesus is standing right in front of you too. If he's standing in front of Mary, who's totally not getting it, who's just crazy, right? She's just so focused on her grief. She's making plans, and while she's talking to him, her brain is over here, her mind is over here. He didn't give up on her. He didn't go, you're crazy, I'm out of here. He went to the other women, they fell at his feet. They were second, right? Right after this, he went to the other women, they fell down and grabbed his feet and worshiped him. He could have just said, I've got better things to do than stand here talking to this lady who's not paying attention. Her mind is elsewhere. She's thinking other things. I got better things to do. There's people waiting for me who are going to fall down and worship me, who are going to grab my feet. No. He says, Mary. Jesus stands there in our grief. Jesus stands there in our depression. Jesus stands there in front of us in our loneliness. Jesus stands there with us in our trials and tribulations. Jesus stands right there in front of us in our slumps. Do you want to survive these things? Wipe the grief off your mind and focus on Jesus. Your joy will come out. Your sorrow will be turned to joy, right? Jesus is alive. Jesus is risen. Don't let this be you, this first part of Mary here. Don't let that be you. Jesus is right here in this written word, standing right before our very eyes in this written word, right? This is how he is standing here in our place, in our lives, How he's standing right here next to us. In the word we find him. So find him and find the grace he has for you in your time of need. Be alert. Be clear-minded. React. Respond. And Jesus has grace for you.